It all began on a sweltering July morning, the kind where the sun feels like it's trying to punish you personally, and I was sipping my black coffee on the porch of my sprawling, neglected acreage that no one had bothered with for years, when the first notice arrived. A crisp, stamped envelope from the Hillside Estates HOA, declaring in bold, unforgiving letters that I owed $1 million fine for what they called illegal land modifications and nuisance violations, though I hadn't set foot on the property for months beyond basic upkeep. At first I laughed because I assumed it was a clerical error, a miscommunication, or maybe one of those petty neighborhood scams aimed at terrified homeowners, but then I read the fine's breakdown, and every word was dripping with malicious precision. A citation for unauthorized landscaping, one for obstruction of community aesthetics, another for illegal pond expansion, and even charges for having an unauthorized number of trees per square foot, an absurdity so ridiculous it made my blood boil because the HOA didn't just overstep, they were weaponizing their tiny legal authority to extort anyone they could, and in this case, they thought they could bully me out of my inheritance with threats and inflated penalties, unaware that the land in question was not just my family property but a sprawling 500-acre plot I had legally owned for generations, complete with rights that no HOA had ever managed to trample on, a fact I was more than prepared to enforce when the time came. Yet as the initial shock faded and I scrolled through the HOA's attached notices, threatening liens, possible court actions, and the ominous prospect of a foreclosure auction, I realized this wouldn't be just another legal battle, it would be war, and the enemy was the type of self-important, power-hungry woman who called herself Karen, the HOA president, a woman who strutted through neighborhood meetings like she owned the sun, whose laugh alone made people flinch, whose threats were as inflated as her ego, and who had somehow convinced a council of equally petty officers that the law was theirs to bend at whim. So I did what any reasonable person with the patience of a saint but the temperament of a hurricane would do. I started gathering evidence, old deeds, surveys, tax records, photos of the property taken over decades, proof that every violation they cited was either non-existent or sanctioned under prior agreements, but as I dug deeper, I discovered something even more infuriating. The HOA had not only been sending these notices to me but to several other families who owned land adjacent to mine, systematically trying to seize control, inflate fees, and consolidate power over an area they had no legitimate claim to, and the audacity of Karen hit me like a brick wall the next day when she personally showed up at the property, her enormous frame cutting an almost comical silhouette against the morning sun, arms crossed over her designer blazer, glaring down at me as if I were some lowly trespasser, her assistants in tow with clipboards and cameras, taking photographs of my perfectly legal structures, marking trees and measuring distances with a level of obsessive attention that could only be described as pathological, and she had the gall to smirk and say, "You'll be paying for every inch of this land you've misused," as if my own property were a crime scene, and in that moment, something inside me snapped, a cold, calculating fury replacing any trace of civility, because Karen had no idea she had just awakened a beast who was willing to play the long game, to pull every legal string, to manipulate every loophole in the system, and to expose the rot at the core of Hillside Estates, and I decided then and there that the $1 million fine would not be paid, that the insults and harassment would not be tolerated, and that the only way to respond to someone who believed they could wield paper as a weapon was to remind them that the law could cut both ways, especially when wielded by someone who understood it better than the average HOA drone. I started drafting letters, gathering affidavits, calling in old family lawyers who still had connections in the county courthouse, and even consulting a retired real estate investigator who assured me that Karen's empire of intimidation had weaknesses, small cracks in her facade, and that if I played my cards right, those cracks could become canyons. And as days turned into weeks, I watched Karen escalate, sending increasingly aggressive notices, threatening liens, attempting to freeze my bank accounts linked to the property, even parking her massive SUV directly on my driveway one afternoon, blocking access to the main gate, and I watched neighbors whisper and gossip, afraid to speak, afraid to intervene, yet they all secretly envied the audacity that had driven me to stand my ground, and I realized that the next step would be decisive, not reactive. So I began a covert plan to turn the tables, leveraging the very rules Karen had been abusing against her, researching every clause in the HOA charter, every precedent in state law, every historical easement and property right that proved beyond question that the land was mine outright, that any HOA actions could be challenged not just in court but in the public eye, and the more I dug, the more I discovered, Karen and her allies had skirted the law in so many ways, collecting unauthorized fees, applying fines retroactively, ignoring zoning ordinances, even falsifying meeting minutes to justify their power grabs, and I realized this wasn't just a simple fight over money, it was a battle for truth, for justice, for reclaiming authority that had been stolen through arrogance and ignorance, and as I formulated a strategy, I began secretly documenting every interaction, every threat, every overreach, installing cameras around the property under the guise of security, noting license plates, timing, conversations, and within weeks, I had built a dossier that could rival any small legal firm's case file, and when Karen tried to escalate by calling in private security to intimidate me, I was ready, not with anger but with evidence, preemptive injunctions, and a meticulously planned announcement to the HOA board that would not only expose their misconduct but legally challenge their authority over a single square foot of my land, setting the stage for the kind of confrontation that would make headlines in neighborhood newsletters and court filings alike. And every time I imagined Karen's smug expression turning into panic, I knew I was on the right path, because the $1 million fine she thought would crush me was actually the spark that ignited a plan to evict the HOA from my land entirely, reclaiming control, restoring my family's property rights, and teaching every petty tyrant in the hillside estates that audacity and wealth do not grant immunity from the consequences of their own greed. The morning the first legal papers arrived was colder than the day itself. I remember standing at the edge of my sprawling property, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt roads and empty fields, when a courier handed me a thick envelope stamped with the county seal and the unmistakable logo of Hillside Estates HOA, and inside, the documents were more than just threats. They were a full-scale assault on my ownership, detailing yet another $1 million fine, this time citing unauthorized construction of a minor access road, despite the fact that the path in question had existed for decades, worn into the earth by generations of my family's trucks and horses, and they even had the audacity to attach diagrams with measurements that were deliberately false, showing the road encroaching on common HOA land that, according to their own charter, didn't exist. And as I scanned the pages, my hands trembled not with fear but with barely contained rage, because Karen had personally signed each notice, her signature looping across the page like a declaration of war, and I realized that this wasn't just harassment, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation designed to make me think I was alone, powerless, and at the mercy of a woman whose ego was larger than any courtroom she would ever enter. But I wasn't alone, and I wasn't powerless, because the very moment I opened those papers, I had already begun the mental blueprint for dismantling her entire operation, leveraging every ounce of my legal knowledge, every loophole, and every piece of historical documentation I could find. And as the days passed, Karen's behavior became more erratic. She began calling me personally, her voice dripping with condescension, alternating between false sweetness and threats so thinly veiled that they could be considered criminal intimidation, telling me that if I didn't pay the fines immediately, she would escalate to the courts, hire private investigators, and even place liens that could force a foreclosure auction. And the more I listened, the more I realized how badly she underestimated me, how blinded she was by her sense of invincibility, and so I responded not with anger but with strategy. I began meticulously recording every conversation, every voicemail, every casual comment she made about taking control, and combined it with the growing mountain of evidence showing her and the HOA's repeated violations, including unpermitted construction, misappropriation of association funds, falsified meeting minutes, and even coercion of neighbors to support her schemes under threat of their own fines. And I also reached out to an old acquaintance, a retired judge who had once overseen property disputes in the county, whose calm voice and deep understanding of legal precedents reassured me that we were not only on solid ground but that we could turn every one of Karen's overreaches into an undeniable demonstration of misconduct, which meant that the fight was no longer reactive, it was proactive, and I began a systematic campaign, filing formal complaints with the state HOA Oversight Board, preparing petitions for temporary injunctions to prevent them from trespassing or obstructing access, and even posting public notices in the community newsletter, disguised as property updates, that subtly highlighted discrepancies in the HOA's claims, all while Karen continued her harassment, appearing on the property at odd hours, sending men in SUVs to drive back and forth, taking photos of every tree, every fence, every minor outbuilding as if they were military reconnaissance units surveying enemy lines, yet she had no idea that cameras, drones, and strategically placed sensors were quietly documenting every intrusion, every illegitimate measurement, and that within weeks, I had amassed not just a dossier but a digital fortress of proof that could withstand any HOA lawyer she could possibly hire. And then came the turning point. I discovered that Karen had personally forged a property line agreement with a neighbor, attempting to annex a portion of my land into her HOA-controlled parcels. And the audacity of this revelation left me simultaneously furious and exhilarated, because it meant that not only was she vulnerable legally, but that I could use her own overreach to unravel her credibility with the entire board, the county, and the neighbors who had blindly trusted her. And so I began planning a series of decisive actions. First, a legal notice challenging the forged agreement. Second, a public campaign to expose the fraudulent fines. Third, a coordinated effort to reclaim access to every part of my property that she had tried to control. And fourth, a carefully timed announcement that the HOA had been acting outside its charter and under repeated violations of state law, which would effectively strip them of any legal authority over my land. And while all this was being prepared, Karen's desperation became almost palpable. She started sending letters demanding meetings at increasingly inconvenient hours, threatening to involve law enforcement in disputes that had no basis, accusing me of harassment for responding to her illegal actions, and even attempting to intimidate my employees by implying that their jobs were contingent on my compliance. Yet every move she made only tightened the noose of evidence around her neck, and I watched it unfold with a meticulous patience, arranging for a professional surveyor to formally mark the property lines, documenting each interaction with timestamps, securing affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed her intimidation tactics, and quietly assembling a legal team who specialized not just in property law but in exposing HOA corruption. And as the summer stretched into late August, Karen became increasingly erratic, showing up at my gate in designer heels, her face red with fury, waving notices in my face, trying to assert control over land that had been in my family for generations. Yet I remained calm, recording everything, letting her dig her own grave, because every threat she made, every overstep, every moment of hubris was being cataloged, creating a domino effect that I knew would culminate in a dramatic public reckoning. And then, one afternoon, as I reviewed the latest stack of HOA notices, I realized I had everything I needed: proof of forgery, evidence of repeated harassment, financial misappropriation, illegal fines, false claims about property lines, and witnesses ready to testify. And I understood in that moment that the $1 million fine was no longer a weapon against me. It was a blueprint for the ultimate counterstrike, a justification for not only reclaiming my land but also exposing Karen and her board to public scrutiny, legal consequences, and total loss of credibility. And so I began drafting the documents, preparing the announcements, planning the eviction of the HOA from my property, knowing that when the moment came, Karen would be powerless to stop me, because I had transformed every ounce of her aggression into ammunition for a decisive, irreversible victory. And every action she took, every sneer, every condescending letter, every arrogant assumption that I would fold, only made the final outcome sweeter, because this wasn't just about money, fines, or property. It was about justice, pride, and the unassailable truth that audacity, cunning, and preparation could turn even the most brazen HOA tyrant into a cautionary tale for generations to come. The day everything shifted from quiet maneuvering to open confrontation arrived without warning, crashing into my life like a thunderclap on a clear sky, because at precisely 8:17 a.m. my phone erupted with alerts, emails from the county clerk, messages from my legal team, and a furious voicemail from Karen herself, her voice shrill and cracking as she accused me of sabotage and illegal interference, which I knew instantly meant that the first domino had fallen. And as I stood in my kitchen, staring out over the vast stretch of land she had tried to steal with paperwork and intimidation, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Certainty, because the injunction we had filed overnight had been approved at an emergency hearing, temporarily stripping the HOA of any authority to issue fines, trespass, or interfere with my property until a full judicial review could be completed. And that single legal order shattered the illusion of control Karen had built her entire identity around. Yet instead of retreating, she did what tyrants always do when their power is threatened. She doubled down, sending a mass email to every homeowner claiming I was attempting to destroy the community, accusing me of bribing officials, spreading lies about forged documents, and urging residents to stand united against what she called an external threat. And while her message sparked fear among some neighbors, it also triggered something far more dangerous for her: scrutiny, because within hours my own carefully prepared response went live, a factual, evidence-backed statement sent to the same mailing list, outlining in precise, unemotional detail the forged property line agreement, the falsified HOA minutes, the illegal retroactive fines, and the repeated acts of harassment, complete with references to publicly accessible filings and case numbers that anyone could verify. And suddenly the narrative Karen had controlled for years was no longer hers alone, because people began asking questions, posting screenshots, comparing documents, and realizing that the woman who had bullied them into silence might not be the invincible authority she claimed to be, and as the tension rippled through the neighborhood, Karen made her biggest mistake yet. She came to my land again, uninvited, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a private security guard, storming toward my main gate as if sheer force of personality could override a court order, shouting that she had every right to be there, that the injunction was temporary nonsense, and that I would regret humiliating her. And I remember the surreal calm I felt as I stepped outside, recording device active, court documents in hand, and calmly informed her that she was trespassing, that her presence violated a judge's order, and that she needed to leave immediately. But Karen, red-faced and shaking with rage, laughed and tried to push past the gate, and in that moment she crossed the line from overreach into outright self-destruction, because within minutes sheriff's deputies arrived. Not because I called them in a panic, but because my legal team had anticipated exactly this scenario and coordinated with local authorities to enforce the injunction. And watching Karen's expression shift from fury to disbelief as she was escorted off my property was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Yet I knew better than to celebrate too early, because humiliation only fuels people like her. And sure enough, the retaliation came fast and reckless, with Karen attempting to call an emergency HOA meeting to vote on collective action against me, proposing astronomical special assessments and legal fees to fund what she called a community defense. But this time, the fear she relied on failed to materialize, because homeowners, emboldened by the injunction and the growing pile of evidence, began to push back, demanding transparency, financial records, and explanations for the forged documents that she could no longer deny. And as pressure mounted, I released the final piece of my strategy, a formal notice of land reclamation, backed by historical deeds and state law, asserting that the HOA's infrastructure, including signage, guard shacks, access roads, and administrative offices, was partially built on my land under invalid easements, and that unless corrected, those structures constituted unlawful occupation, effectively meaning the HOA itself was trespassing. And the shockwaves from that revelation were immediate and explosive, because suddenly Karen wasn't just defending fines or authority, she was defending the physical existence of the HOA on land it had no right to occupy. And the board fractured under the strain, with some members resigning outright, others attempting to distance themselves from her decisions, and Karen, cornered and furious, lashed out publicly, accusing me of orchestrating a hostile takeover, threatening countersuits, and promising to bankrupt me. Yet behind closed doors, the reality was far less confident, because her lawyers began withdrawing, citing conflicts and unfavorable risk, and my own attorneys moved swiftly, filing motions to enforce removal of HOA structures from my land, seeking damages for years of unauthorized use, and requesting a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. And as the legal machinery ground forward, neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped me to thank me, to share stories of intimidation, of fines that ruined vacations, of threats that kept them awake at night, and each testimony strengthened the case, transforming what began as a personal vendetta into a collective reckoning. And by the time the preliminary hearing date was set, the outcome was already tilting in my favor, because Karen's power depended on fear and ignorance, and both had evaporated under the harsh light of evidence. And as I prepared my final filings, outlining not just the right to reclaim my land but to formally evict the HOA from every square foot it unlawfully occupied, I felt the weight of history pressing forward, knowing that this was bigger than revenge, bigger than money, bigger than ego. It was about ending a regime built on intimidation and restoring control to those who had been bullied into submission. And when Karen sent one last message, a rambling, rage-filled email threatening consequences she no longer had the power to enforce, I didn't respond, because the courts, the neighbors, and the truth itself were already answering for me, and the eviction of the HOA from my land was no longer a daring plan or a distant threat. It was an inevitability, closing in on Karen with every passing day, unstoppable, irreversible, and entirely of her own making. The morning of the formal eviction hearing arrived like a storm breaking over a calm sea, sudden, unstoppable, and electric, because as I drove down the long, winding driveway of my sprawling property, surrounded by acres of land that had been in my family for generations, I could feel the tension radiating from every corner, from the trees swaying in the breeze to the quiet hum of construction equipment removing remnants of HOA signage and barricades. And I knew that today would not be about negotiation or polite confrontation. It would be a full-scale, public dismantling of Karen's empire, a reckoning decades in the making, because she had underestimated me at every turn, blinded by her ego and the illusion of absolute control. Yet now, as I walked into the courthouse, papers meticulously organized, evidence stacked neatly in color-coded folders, cameras set up to document every angle, and witnesses prepared to testify, I felt a calm certainty settle over me, a rare combination of anticipation and resolve, knowing that the mountain of proof we had assembled, illegal fines, forged documents, unauthorized structures on my land, witness affidavits, financial discrepancies, and recorded interactions, was more than enough to not only nullify her claims but to permanently strip her and her board of authority over my property. And as the courtroom filled, Karen arrived in her usual dramatic fashion, flanked by 2 remaining board members who looked increasingly uneasy. Her expensive blazer tightly cinched, heels clicking across the floor with a rhythm meant to assert dominance. But today that dominance was meaningless because the weight of law, precedent, and irrefutable evidence sat with me at the counsel's table. And as the judge called the session to order, I began presenting our case calmly, methodically, letting each piece of evidence speak for itself. The forged property line agreements, clearly marked survey discrepancies, video recordings of trespassing, affidavits from neighbors, and historical deeds proving my family's ownership. And with each revelation, the color drained from Karen's face, her smug posture faltering, her voice rising in protests that were immediately countered with references to specific statutes and previous rulings, and the courtroom, initially tense and quiet, began to stir with murmurs, because this was more than a simple property dispute. It was a public exposure of a woman who had manipulated fear, bureaucracy, and ignorance to consolidate power, and as her protests turned to near hysterics, the judge, a stern, no-nonsense figure who had seen countless disputes but rarely this level of audacity, leaned forward, demanding clarity, and each time Karen attempted to interject with threats, accusations, or bluster, I presented documentation that not only neutralized her claims but highlighted repeated misconduct, illustrating a pattern of illegal behavior that left the board vulnerable to sanctions and personal liability. And when we reached the section detailing the unauthorized structures, including guard shacks, signage, and private roads, built partially on my land without easements, the room gasped, because the implications were staggering. The HOA had been functioning on illegally occupied land, collecting fines and enforcing rules over residents who had no legitimate authority, and the judge, reading through the exhibits, nodded gravely, recognizing the severity of the violations. And then came the moment I had anticipated for months. The eviction order itself, a formal declaration that all HOA operations, administrative offices, and affiliated infrastructure were to be removed immediately from my property, that Karen and her board had no authority over any part of the land, that fines previously levied were null and void, and that any future attempt to interfere would be considered trespassing with immediate legal consequences. And as the words were spoken, I felt the satisfaction of a battle long planned finally manifest into reality, while Karen's face contorted with rage, disbelief, and desperation. Her voice caught somewhere between protest and panic, as she realized that every petty threat she had made, every attempt to intimidate, every inflated fine had been turned into evidence of her own undoing, and while the eviction was already legally binding, I had anticipated further resistance. So simultaneous to the ruling, my team coordinated with local authorities to begin the orderly removal of unauthorized HOA structures, while ensuring safety, documenting compliance, and sending a clear message. The property was mine, fully, and no intimidation, no bureaucratic maneuvering, and no tantrum from Karen could change that. And as the process unfolded over the following hours, neighbors began arriving, some quietly, some openly supportive, some merely curious, and every eye on the property witnessed the dismantling of what had been, in their perception, an untouchable HOA empire. And Karen, in a final act of defiance, attempted to rally her few remaining supporters, threatening legal action, calling the removal illegal and tyrannical. But each statement was met with calm explanations, court orders, and evidence-backed refutations that left her with nowhere to turn, while I stood at the edge of my property, watching the culmination of months of preparation, strategy, and patience unfold in real time, a sense of vindication and triumph washing over me, because this was not only about reclaiming land or nullifying fines, it was a public, undeniable demonstration that audacity, intelligence, and preparation could dismantle even the most entrenched, arrogant authority. And as the sun set over my reclaimed acres, Karen retreated, humiliated and powerless, the remnants of her empire scattered, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the HOA could never again assert control over what was rightfully mine, that every threat she had issued had rebounded, magnified, into a crushing defeat, and that the land, my heritage, and my rights had been secured in a way that would echo through the neighborhood for years, a lesson in vigilance, persistence, and the unassailable power of turning every ounce of oppression into ammunition for victory. Even as the last of the HOA signs were hauled away and the court's eviction order settled like a heavy weight over Karen's crumbling authority, I knew the war wasn't over. In fact, the moment she realized her empire had been dismantled, her desperation became almost palpable, a wild energy that could only lead to reckless and dangerous moves, because Karen didn't understand patience, subtlety, or strategy, only confrontation, threats, and theatrics. And in the days following the eviction, she escalated to levels that were both absurd and sinister, sending letters to neighbors accusing me of harassment, calling local authorities with fabricated claims of property abuse, attempting to file frivolous lawsuits against contractors removing HOA property from my land, and even posting online rants claiming the court was biased and that I had bribed officials. Yet every one of these moves only strengthened my position because my legal team had already anticipated them, had documented every communication, every threat, every false claim, and each time she tried to act, we countered, filing restraining notices, presenting evidence, and making sure the public record reflected her misconduct. And while she raged, I began a second phase of my plan, reclaiming control over the parts of the neighborhood still under her influence, making sure that no HOA representative could interfere with my property or intimidate neighbors, contacting residents directly, quietly educating them on their rights and encouraging them to demand transparency and accountability, which caused a ripple effect of scrutiny on every aspect of Hillside Estates operations. And as Karen watched her control dissolve, she became reckless beyond reason, attempting to physically block access to roads she claimed were community property, parking her massive SUVs across gates, leaving personal notes threatening fines for anyone aiding me, and even trying to convince some local contractors to halt work. Under the pretense of legal injunctions she had no authority to enforce, yet each move only revealed her ignorance of the law, because my team was ready, my documentation airtight, and every neighbor who had witnessed her actions willing to testify or report misconduct. And the psychological effect of this was incredible. Karen's aura of invincibility had completely collapsed, replaced by paranoia, fear, and confusion, and I knew that once you strip someone like her of power, they will make mistakes, and those mistakes become the evidence for ultimate victory, and so I orchestrated a meticulous strategy, carefully timing legal filings, public announcements, and enforcement actions to maximize exposure and minimize resistance, culminating in a notice sent directly to Karen and the board, detailing the remaining unauthorized HOA structures on my land, the timeline for their removal, and a clear warning that any further attempt to interfere would result in immediate personal liability for damages. And as she read the notice, I imagined the panic setting in, the scrambling calls to lawyers, the internal arguments as board members realized they had been complicit in illegal actions. And then, in a final blow, I initiated a public audit of HOA finances, revealing misappropriation, inflated fines, and improper collection of fees from residents, which not only discredited Karen but also exposed the HOA to potential state penalties, civil suits, and the loss of credibility with every neighbor she had manipulated for years. And as the first contractors began removing the last of the HOA's administrative structures, Karen made one last desperate attempt at confrontation, arriving at the property with a small group of loyalists, waving legal papers and threats, demanding I halt all actions, claiming eminent domain, accusing me of violating HOA covenants, and attempting to intimidate the workers. Yet every single action was anticipated. Deputies were stationed, cameras were recording, my legal team was ready, and every claim she made was countered with hard evidence, statutory authority, and court orders. And as she realized that none of her threats carried weight, her massive frame shaking with rage, she finally understood the depth of her defeat, the totality of her loss, and the reality that she no longer controlled a single inch of the property she had sought to dominate. And in the end, as I stood amidst the reclaimed land watching contractors dismantle the last remnants of her illegal occupation, neighbors began to emerge, curious, supportive, and even celebratory, acknowledging that the law, preparation, and patience had triumphed over arrogance, threats, and intimidation. And in that moment, a profound sense of satisfaction settled over me, because what had begun as a simple dispute over $1 million fine had transformed into a full-scale reclamation of property, authority, and dignity, teaching Karen, her board, and every other would-be tyrant that no amount of ego, deceit, or abuse of power could withstand meticulous strategy, legal foresight, and the unyielding assertion of one's rights. And as the sun set over my acres, freshly freed from HOA interference, I realized that victory was not just personal. It was a statement to every neighbor, every observer, and every bureaucratic bully that justice, when pursued with patience, intelligence, and relentless determination, is not only inevitable but devastatingly final. By the time the following week rolled around, it became clear that Karen's desperation had reached a level bordering on delusion, because every step she took was reactive, clumsy, and counterproductive. And as I walked across the reclaimed acres of my property, the morning sunlight illuminating the vast open fields that had been under threat for years, I realized that the eviction and the public exposure of the HOA had not only neutralized her authority but had created a vacuum of power that she was frantically trying to fill, attempting once again to assert control over non-existent HOA jurisdiction, this time by sending letters to contractors, utility companies, and even local government offices claiming urgent community safety concerns and illegal activity on my land, none of which had any legal or factual basis. Yet every attempt to intimidate or delay progress was met with immediate, documented rebuttal from my legal team, who were prepared for every scenario, and the beauty of the strategy lay in anticipation. We had set up monitoring systems, surveillance, and preemptive injunctions that rendered her threats powerless, while every neighbor who had once quietly endured her tyranny was now emboldened, witnessing firsthand the total collapse of her influence, and even a few former HOA supporters began quietly defecting, realizing that siding with Karen was siding with illegality, incompetence, and humiliation. And as the hours stretched into days, Karen escalated further, arranging private community protests at the property entrance, waving banners, chanting slogans about our rights and lawful oversight. Yet ironically, every claim she made was provably false. Her banners contained errors, her slogans contradicted legal records, and she was documented verbally admitting in private to neighbors and board members that the entire operation had been orchestrated without proper authority, creating a paper trail so incriminating it practically guaranteed complete collapse if reviewed by any competent official. And I watched as her frustration became more visible, her once commanding presence reduced to frantic gesticulations, her voice cracking under pressure, her assistants whispering nervously as they realized they were witnesses to her unraveling. And in response, I executed the next phase of the plan, one designed not just to neutralize her but to permanently prevent her or any future HOA from regaining authority, issuing formal legal notices declaring total ownership, exclusive rights to all land and structures, preemptive eviction clauses for any unauthorized personnel, and a public communication to residents and contractors clarifying my sole authority over the property, coupled with a comprehensive legal filing documenting every past violation by the HOA, thereby creating an unassailable record that could withstand any future attempts to claim authority. And as these actions took effect, Karen's desperation became almost theatrical because she now faced the reality that her own board members had begun questioning her competence, some quietly resigning or attempting to distance themselves, leaving her isolated, powerless, and publicly humiliated, while contractors proceeded without hesitation, restoring damaged land, removing any unauthorized fencing or barriers, and reinforcing gates under my explicit supervision. And every move was documented, creating a permanent record of both the HOA's overreach and my legal and operational response. And then came the climax of Karen's last-ditch efforts. She attempted to physically enter the property during a heavily documented inspection, claiming that she had emergency authority to oversee maintenance, a claim so audacious it could only be categorized as delusional. And as her SUV approached the main gate, I signaled the deputies stationed strategically across the property, who intercepted her immediately, while my cameras recorded everything, capturing her enraged protests, threats of legal action, and complete disregard for court orders. And as she was formally warned of trespassing, citing both the eviction and newly enacted preemptive clauses, her expression shifted from fury to stunned disbelief, realizing that every pathway she had tried to manipulate had been blocked, documented, and legally reinforced. And in that instant, it became obvious to everyone present, including neighbors who had come to witness the enforcement, that Karen's reign of intimidation was over permanently, irreversibly, and that the property, my family's heritage, and the peace of the land were firmly under lawful control. And as I walked through the property that evening, sunlight casting long shadows across the reclaimed fields, the reality settled in. Karen had been defeated not by brute force or rash action, but by meticulous planning, anticipation of every possible move, public accountability, and legal precision. And as contractors finished reinforcing gates, restoring access, and removing all traces of HOA overreach, a sense of profound satisfaction washed over me, because the battle that had begun with $1 million fine, a threat meant to intimidate and subjugate, had culminated in a total reversal, with Karen exposed, humiliated, powerless, and legally restrained from ever interfering again, and every neighbor, every witness, every document now stood as proof that preparation, patience, and strategic action could topple even the most arrogant and tyrannical authority, leaving no doubt that the land, my rights, and my victory were absolute, complete, and forever secured. By the time the following week arrived, Karen's desperation had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, an unhinged mixture of fear, rage, and irrational determination, because the eviction, the public exposure, the legal filings, and the total removal of unauthorized structures had not only stripped her of authority but had created a vacuum she could not comprehend. And as I walked along the newly restored roads and cleared fields of my property, the scale of her collapse became undeniable. Contractors moved freely, deputies monitored key points, and every neighbor who had once feared her influence now watched with quiet awe as her empire disintegrated. Yet Karen refused to accept reality, plotting increasingly reckless maneuvers to reclaim control, sending frantic letters to county offices accusing me of violating HOA covenants, attempting to file last-minute lawsuits to freeze funds or halt construction, and even trying to organize a few remaining loyalists to physically block access to my land, each act more absurd than the last. And as I anticipated, these moves were not only ineffective but self-incriminating, because my legal team had preemptively documented every interaction, every claim, every trespass, and every intimidation attempt, creating a comprehensive record that left Karen exposed on every front. And in a final, almost theatrical escalation, she attempted to enter the property with 2 SUVs, a few loyal supporters, and a stack of hastily printed papers claiming emergency authority. But before she could even reach the main gate, deputies intercepted her, backed by my legal documentation and court orders, while cameras captured every second of her frantic protests, threats, and panicked attempts to assert control. And as her supporters dispersed, muttering excuses, the reality of her total defeat began to dawn on her, because every avenue she had tried, intimidation, legal maneuvering, public pressure, and threats, had been anticipated, blocked, and rendered useless, and the humiliation was complete. Karen's massive frame, once a symbol of dominance in the neighborhood, now trembled in frustration, rage, and disbelief as she realized that the very land she had tried to control with arrogance and deceit was untouchable, lawfully mine, and permanently protected. And with every failing attempt, the HOA's credibility crumbled further, with former board members quietly resigning, neighbors openly siding with me, and the remaining structure of the organization exposed as both illegal and irrelevant. And as I oversaw the final removal of every remaining unauthorized structure, verified by surveyors and deputies, I could see the broader impact. The neighborhood that had lived under fear and petty rules for years was witnessing a total restoration of lawful order, a clear message that illegitimate authority could be challenged, defeated, and removed, and even Karen's attempts to spread misinformation, online or through private channels, were neutralized, because every statement she made had been documented, countered, and legally disproven, leaving her reputation in tatters, her influence gone, and her ego shattered. And as I walked across my acres, sunlight fading over the restored fields, the realization settled in like a tide. The $1 million fine, the intimidation, the harassment, and the audacity of Karen's actions had all been turned against her, each move cataloged, each violation exposed, each threat neutralized, creating a cascading effect that ensured not only my victory but the permanent protection of my property, authority, and legacy. And as the final contractor packed up equipment, neighbors nodded in quiet acknowledgement, deputies confirmed compliance, and the legal team filed the last motion sealing the eviction and protections, a profound sense of satisfaction and vindication washed over me, because this was not just a personal triumph over an overbearing HOA president, it was a comprehensive, strategic, and irreversible dismantling of an entire corrupt structure, a testament to patience, foresight, and relentless determination, proving that no amount of arrogance, deception, or intimidation could withstand the power of meticulous planning, legal authority, and unwavering resolve. And as I stood at the center of my restored land, breathing in the evening air, I knew with absolute certainty that Karen's reign of tyranny was over, never to return, and that every inch of my property, every tree, every road, every acre, and every resident's respect was now firmly secured, a lasting reminder that audacity, when met with preparation and precision, can transform even the gravest threats into undeniable victory.